Welcome to the Well-Seasoned Librarian podcast. Today I'm very happy to be talking with author Suzanne Cope. She is a food writer, journalist, and lecturer at New York University. She's written about food and culture for a variety of publications, including the New York Times, The Atlantic, CNN, and the BBC. Her work has focused on the intersection of food politics and social justice. Her latest book, Power Hungry, Women of the Black Panther Party and Freedom Summer and Their Fight to Feed a Movement, tells the story of how two women used food to fight for social change during the civil rights movement. Suzanne, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Suzanne, for our listeners who are unfamiliar with your work, where are you from and where do you live in the U.S.?
Sure. I'm from actually Western New York, a small town in south of Buffalo, but I live in Brooklyn. And as you noted, I teach at NYU.
When did you decide in your life that writing would basically be your life?
Well, I don't know if it's my life, but I actually came to writing a little bit late. My mom would tell stories about, and I remember too, like writing some stories when I was younger, but I really loved to read. And so I went to college, to undergrad. I went to a SUNY state school, and I was an English major because that's what you do when you love to read. And I didn't really know what I was going to do afterwards. There was someone who came to campus, and she talked about going to this grad program. It wasn't a degree program; it was just a summer program where she learned the ins and outs of book publishing. So I thought that sounded great. Would like be surrounded by books? I was really excited about that, and so I did that program at where was I? It was in Denver. And this was a long time ago. And then I ended up getting a job at Houghton Mifflin in Boston. And so I moved to Boston, and I was surrounded by books and working for a book publisher. And I made a lot of really great friends who I'm still friends with. And it wasn't until I was in the book publishing world that I thought, oh, I could be a writer. I could write. And it was interesting because I don't know. It wasn't something that I didn't know any writers. I didn't really know that could be my job, which sounds ridiculous having read so many books, but it just goes to show you that seeing a job modeled for you is, as a kid, is so important to imagining what you could be in the future. And so after being there for a couple of years, and also I have to give some credit to my husband because I had met him, after a couple of years there, and he is a musician. And so I really saw someone pursuing their art and also encouraging me to pursue what I began to see as my art. And so I went back and got my MFA, knowing that I wanted to teach with that as well, in creative nonfiction. And then I started teaching with that. And then I quickly realized that it didn't really prepare me to teach composition and first year writing, which is primarily what I was teaching. So I went back and got my PhD in adult learning. And that was really great because I got to delve into the psychology, the cognitive development of writing and of teaching of writing. And I got to learn how to be a better teacher. But at the same time, since you're teaching someone to do the craft that you are also doing, you learn a lot about yourself as a writer and how to think about, talk about writing. So yeah, I really learned so much about teaching and writing in both of those programs. And once I finished that, because I had to be so focused on scholarship during my time in this very fast-paced doctoral program, after that is when I was able to really think about what is it that I want to write. And I turned to food writing soon after that because I saw it as a way. The food writing discipline, scholarly discipline, it was often, you could see kind of the personal informing the scholarly and the scholarly informing the personal. And that was a direction that I went into right after I graduated.
What inspired you to explore the intersection of food and the Black freedom struggle?
Well, like many people I've spoken to or read stories of anecdotally, after a certain presidential election, I was looking around me and I saw a lot of people in the food world that I was kind of connected to using food as a tool for activism. And I had been working on this really interesting book about book project. I wasn't, actively writing the full manuscript on this woman who was, kind of combining politics and social movement and food in Cuba. And it, but my focus kind of shifted towards what was happening around me at that time. And also at that time, Cuba had been in the news, you had been able to travel to Cuba, and then it became pretty clear that you weren't going to be able to travel there as easily anymore. So I kind of shifted my focus. And I started researching these stories of how people used food as a tool for political and social change. And so I had this book project that I was dreaming of being like wanting to be informed and inspired by these women of maybe like the last century-ish, in modern times. And so I was looking at, World War II, and I was looking at the civil rights movement and other times globally. And so I had these stories that I was kind of collecting, and speaking with my agent, we kind of homed in on Aline Quinn and her story, just, thinking this is something that seems like people would be interested in, and it was something we were both interested in, with various struggles that were happening at that time. But because I had first imagined it as part of a larger book project, I was a little worried, because that's the interesting thing about research, right? Is that when you start to research, that there's stories out there, but you can't research something if it's not there to be found, and there's so much to be said. We probably don't have time around this, but of course you're a librarian of what are these research silences, right?
Yeah.
You can identify where there's not information, but it's really hard to fill in those silences, especially as, we get farther and farther from that time period. So she and I were kind of brainstorming of what a book focused on Aline Quinn's story might look like. And it was interesting because she brought up, I believe it was maybe we both had kind of talked about the Black Panther Party. It might have been her idea as well. And I just thought to myself, I was like, oh, I know that story. And then I realized I kind of checked myself and checked my own biases and been like, wait a second, do I know that story? Do I know what I think I know about the Black Panther Party? And so I quickly, or, soon and thereafter, I did some research, and I realized I was so wrong that what I thought I knew about the Black Panther Party was in fact fed by a lot of the propaganda that, had been out there, and also very narrowly focused, like, oh, they started this breakfast program and they were this militant group. And I realized, wait, that is not a complete story. And so I was looking for someone, I was like, okay, there's a couple women who were, because I really wanted to focus on the story of women. And there were a couple women who were talked about in leadership, and, they had a fair amount had been written about, Kathleen Cleaver and some of these other big names. And I thought, is there a woman whose story hasn't really been told, and whose story I could really amplify? And I came across Cleo's name in a couple different places, and I kind of tracked her down on the internet, and I asked her if she'd be willing to chat. And I remember very distinctly our first conversation. I had taught in the morning, and I was in my office at work, and we just had this wonderful conversation. And I began to really see how these stories of the Black Panther Party and what Cleo was doing, how they really could intersect with what was happening, the stories I was learning about Aline Quinn and the voting rights movement. And I developed a book proposal around that. And so for a proposal, you really have to map it out and do a lot of research and know where everything, how it's all going to work together, and have a very clear structure for the book. I mean, proposals, for those who don't know, are often 60, 70, 80 pages long. They're really long and detailed, but of course that means you have more work and more research to do once the book is sold. And so I'm sure we could talk about this in a minute, but the ways that these stories intersected, I didn't anticipate until after I really dug into the research of the book.
In reading your book, I was really it came to realize how little I knew about the Black struggle in the 60s. Now, I had seen a lot of stuff in history class, obviously, and I took, classes in college where we talked about it. This book, to me, though, really seemed to kind of make it more real, and to kind of also make it more personal with the people that you talk to. Now, you talked to Cleo Silvers and Aline Quinn, who were, really big, movers and shakers in this breakfast program, and you talk about this in Power Hungry. What was your perception as you started doing the research? What changed for you, and like your viewpoint of this time period and the breakfast program and the necessity for it?
Sure. So thinking just about the Black Panther Party work. Well, first of all, it was interesting at the time because I started the research right before COVID, and I was so lucky and glad that I had planned a couple trips, like really, in January of 2020 to meet these, people. And Eileen Quinn's no longer alive, but I met her daughter. I met other people who knew her. I spent some time with Cleo, and so those relationships were so instrumental to being able, and I went to Macomb to being able to see where I was writing about, and have a relationship with people who I would later only be able to talk to on the phone or Zoom. So that was really necessary. But then we're in COVID times, and in Brooklyn, and also many other places, there was a lot of talk around mutual aid and how you're helping your neighbor. And then of course, BLM protests were happening. So there was so much that was happening, in the time, and that current time, that was echoing what had happened decades prior. And so, I was having this historical, deep dive, and then watching these same issues come up again, which of course, as I just mentioned, that was kind of my impetus for wanting to research this more anyway. And so I guess, I don't know if I want to say I was surprised, but it was, interesting to be able to see the deeper, history behind issues that were still so resonant, and of course get angry about it and say, why
Yeah.
are these things still happening? And why did we not know how much surveillance was happening both in Mississippi, upon Eileen and these other civil rights workers, but then, more commonly known is, what the FBI was doing with the Black Panthers. And then also research, doing all these interviews with people, particularly with Panthers, and having them tell me stories of how they were continually surveilled and undermined. But I was also encouraged too, even though I was so, frustrated and angry at times, because there was so much hope and there was so much dedication to the cause. And I mean, these were people in both cases that were, both places, that were really willing to, they told me, they said, I was willing to die for this cause. I really truly believed that we would create change. And they did, of course, create so much change in these two separate places. And there were people who were active in both of these causes. Sometimes we look back and be like, oh, why didn't, I wish that we had stronger voting rights laws now. But when you think about where they were starting from, and also the great force, this is the force of a nation, the FBI, the police, state police, like this is who they were fighting against, and they still were able to make such change. That's so inspiring, and I hope that it's inspiring to people today.
I think there might be some people out in the podcast audience who are unfamiliar with the Black Panther breakfast program. Can we talk about this a little bit? Can you tell people about it, and then why it was so controversial, and also how is it different from the free lunch programs? Because I think that's a distinction.
Sure. So it was interesting. One of my first interviews, I went to Macomb, and then I came across the name of Muhammad Hayes, and I found him while I was, on this research trip. He was in New Orleans, and I was flying in and out of New Orleans. So I asked if we could meet, and he was wonderful. He sadly passed away in the last couple of years, but I'm so honored to have been able to meet him. And he told me this great story at the beginning, and he was active in voting rights and other issues in the civil rights era. And then he also did stuff with the Panthers. So he was a really useful person to chat with. But he was telling me about how Ella Baker, who was, a female leader with NAACP, and then she started SNCC, which is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating committee that I talk about, that started working on these voting rights efforts. And she really taught Muhammad and others, of course, that what you have to do is you go to the people and you say, what can I do for you? And don't go in thinking that if you truly want to serve a population, don't go in thinking what they want or what you want to do for them. You go in and say, what can I do for you? What
Yeah.
do you need from me? And so I'm telling this story because he was doing this initially with voting rights, where a lot of people were like, this is too hard. This is not what you should be focusing on. But he said, we went to the people and we said, what can we do? And they said, we want to be able to vote. And then he said, after the voting, which happened first chronologically, a couple years before the Black Panthers, he then was called up by the Panthers, and they said, come help us. You did such amazing organizing. Can you come help us figure out how we can organize and serve the people in the same way? And I remember this moment so well, because we're sitting there at this coffee shop, and he's just he's making these stories come together in this way I had no idea it would happen. And I said, don't tell me you helped start the breakfast program. He's like, I didn't tell them to serve the kids breakfast. I just told them to go ask the people what they wanted. And they did. And the people said, well, I, don't always have food in the house, or I have to go to work early and my kids sometimes don't, get breakfast and get to school on time. And so that's what came out of these conversations was, breakfast would help serve the people. That's what the people wanted. And so they were talking with, other local partners, and this is in the Bay Area, California Bay Area. And there was a priest who they were also asking, because the Panthers were connected with some other parishioners, saying, could you help us reach the people, serve the people? And breakfast came up, and they said, okay, we can help host it. And Father Neil, Earl Neil, was the pastor who is known for, helping them start this first breakfast program and connecting with parishioners and giving them a place. And I found out that he stayed in Ellen Quinn's house, which I couldn't believe. Another moment of these stories coming together. And that was something I didn't know until, into the process. And he had volunteered in Macomb when he was a priest, working out of Chicago. And I was just amazed at that connection. And, it still gives me chills just thinking that these stories came together like that. And so they started to make breakfast, and they went through all of the health, we want to make sure that we are doing this legally, that we have all the certifications we need. They went out and got donations from the community, because they very much believed that the community, these are people in the community, bodegas and grocery stores should help support the people who are supporting them. And it just grew. It caught on like wildfire, and the children came, and within a couple months, it told all of their chapters throughout the country. It said, okay, you all, to be a Black Panther chapter, you need to start your own breakfast program. And so they, told them what they did, and they all, began their own breakfast programs, and found the same thing, that all over the country, in small towns and big cities, that this is what the people wanted. It helped them connect with the community. And not only did they serve them a hot breakfast, but they helped them with homework. They made sure they got to school on time. And they taught them, a lot of the history that wasn't being taught in the schools. Like, Cleo tells these great stories there in the book of, being like, all right, who invented the traffic light? A Black man, and just talking about, Black history and also Hispanic history, because they were very supportive of, the Hispanic farm workers and other issues. And in New York, they connected with the Young Lords, who were, a Hispanic group similar to the Panthers, doing other social justice things. But what I think a lot of people don't, some criticisms, and I very much state in the book that they're unfair, I believe, is that they only did these social justice, these community programs, to kind of garner favor with the community. And no way, like from the very beginning, what the founders said they wanted to do was serve the community and feed them, shelter them, all the basic, everything that you need to survive. And so that was definitely part of their mission from the beginning, their 10-point program that they mentioned. And then, they were so popular, and that was partly, or very much so, why the FBI wanted to shut them down, because as some of the Panthers have said, as Cleo said, and as other Panthers have said, and I quote in the book, we're demonstrating that the government is not fulfilling the needs of the people, even though there is enough to go around. There's clearly enough food for everybody, but for the reasons that uphold the power structure, not everyone still has access to food. And they were pointing that out. And they were Cleo would say, I am a socialist. And this is what I believe in, that we should share the food. We should not just be, capitalists trying to make a buck. We should share and make sure everyone has enough. And so, they saw themselves as pointing out the deficiencies of a capitalist system, and turning people onto their political point of view. And so that was dangerous to the power structure. And also they were becoming very popular. People, were listening to them, and they were becoming influential in the community. So to think, at their heyday, they were, there's a statistic that they were serving more children breakfast than the entire state of California. And so, there was a lunch program, because kids are typically in school during lunch. And so they did have a program for that. But this very much helped to show that there is a problem with, with food security for breakfast as well. And it wasn't until a couple of years afterwards that, in part due to the popularity of this, certainly most people trace the legacy of the free breakfast program to what what the Panthers were doing. They did institute a national breakfast program in addition to the lunch program a couple years after, into the 70s. I forget the exact year, but after the Panthers were, for the most part, disbanded and not doing their breakfast programs anymore.
I want to go back to something you said about making sure it was all legal and by the book, because I've known in my lifetime, I've seen so many times when people would talk about the breakfast program, and they made it sound like an optional program, like it wasn't necessary or needed, but it was very much needed. And I know there's been a lot of political opposition to lunch and breakfast programs since I was young, and I've seen them throughout the years, including now and during the last presidency. What are some of the oppositions you've seen to the programs, and some of the things that have been done to kind of stifle them, because people don't want people knowing that there's hunger going on in America?
Well, I do think that this kind of ties into this whole, if you can't feed your children, then you're doing something wrong. You're a bad
Yeah.
parent. You haven't made good choices. And, if there's one thing I hope that, we're collectively as a country beginning to see, is that, being hungry is not a judgment. It's not a moral failing, right? And we see this a lot actually illustrated in the Eileen Quinn story, is that there were so many economic like ways that they oppressed the Black community economically to keep them associated to the white power structure. And so those were more extreme ways where you see barely paying living wages, but not but these families, say sharecroppers in Mississippi, they have no way to go and find another job. Like they literally do not have enough money to move to another place. Of course, many of them scraped together what they could. That's why we had, the mass migration soon after that, Great Migration soon after that. And if they did anything that was politically unsavory for a lot of the white power structure, they would maybe kick them off the farm where they were living. They would fire them. They would fine them. Many ways that keeping people as close to subsistence as possible was a tool of oppression. And I tell the story in my book, and I was largely retelling it from other scholars who told it, but that there was a time too where there was food assistance available, and the white power structure chose to withhold that food assistance as like a political, retribution for what they saw were, mostly poor Black people who were trying to gain the right to vote. And so those are extreme, but when you think about them and apply them to what's happening in, let's just say, New York City, which is where the other part of the book takes place. I mean, you still have people who are living as close to subsistence as possible. I think that we've kind of, and I'm not going to go into the details, but kind of, no longer really talking about food deserts in quite the same way as we maybe did a decade ago. But still, when you think about the costs of food in a city, what's available to eat, Cleo actually later, after the Panthers, did a lot with community gardens, and I'm very active in community gardens in New York, and she was up in the Bronx and in northern Manhattan. And, you think about all the ways that actually food is expensive, food is withheld, of course, these are ways to oppress a people. And, we perhaps some people have heard the stories of the kids who didn't have enough money to eat lunch in various schools around the nation. I know they came out. I was paying attention to them when I was writing the book a couple of years ago, but I've heard them before and since. And there's always extra food at the cafeterias. And I mean, anyone who has a kid, anyone
Yeah.
who's been to a cafeteria, and to withhold food from a child, I mean, how is that in any way morally acceptable? And
Yeah.
so, when you start to look at all the political underpinnings, it's not, are you a socialist? Are you a capitalist? And I'm using scare quotes here. It's like, really, why is food a commodity? Why is food something
Yeah.
that's there to be withheld? Why are you not just feeding people with the food that you have? And I think that's very much what both of these stories, we're trying to illustrate, and what they were just doing naturally is just saying, we will get the food and we will give it to the people who are hungry, because that is a basic human right.
This program stretched across the United States from California to New York City, but they were also, in my mind, they were uniformly run by women. Why do you think that was the case?
Well, there were, and Cleo would say there are plenty of men who were doing this work, but actually the Panthers were mostly women. They were 2/3, as many as perhaps at one point 3/4 of the Panthers were women. And so you have mostly women in the Panthers. You have women who are, of course, often this is thought of, feeding people, helping children is often thought of as women's work, even though they did a lot of effort within the Panthers to involve the males and say, you need to watch the kids as well. You need to help with everyone help with the breakfast program. But I think it also speaks to the great leadership of women and organizational skills. And I am a mother, and I have done a lot of research thinking both for this book, but also elsewhere, just, all of these skills that we don't think of as being as valuable, financially to, or even just valued in general in our society, of multitasking and organizing and cooking and doing all of these and that are really important, and were important when you're feeding a large group of people. I mean, they put on, I don't want to call it a party, but they put on a catered event every single
Yeah.
day. And, this is a full-time job. And so that really led me down the value of women's work and feminized work. Of course, this is not just the work of women, and it wasn't in these books either, but it is traditionally feminized work and seen as the purview of women. And, and I also, through this book, of course, I'm on here as a food writer, and I still consider myself a food writer, but I've kind of expanded my scope to feminize work more broadly, because so much of this is not just about food, although a lot of it is just thinking about what are the ways that these roles that women, typically women, and of course our conversation around gender is continuing to expand, but typically feminized roles, the roles that women typically have held, that aren't always given the respect that they deserve. How are they so important and so powerful? And I'm trying to give those the respect and do. The term activist mothering was something that comes up in the book. I say coined by Francois Hamlin, but I've since talked to her after I finished the book for another podcast, and she told me that she actually borrowed the term as well. But I still love this term. And even though Cleo never had biological children of her own, she readily has said multiple times that she embraces this term as an activist mother, and thinking about these typically mothering skills that she certainly thinks have been her strength, among her strengths, because she has many strengths for her activist life. And I really want to give strength and power to those those skills that women are using all the time and that were so necessary in COVID, out of COVID. Mutual aid, when we think about that, what is it? It's so often feeding people. It's so often organizing a lot of information and a lot of people and a lot of things, and making sure people have clothes to wear and their home is taken care of. These are often thought of as women's work, and it's so important, and perhaps arguably the most important work that you could do.
In reading your book, I was surprised to find out that there were breakfast programs before the Black Panther breakfast programs that existed in the past. Can you talk about those a little bit?
What do you mean exactly? Do you mean the just people feeding others broadly? I mean, I think it's just a matter of of seeing the need in the community and filling it. I mean, the Panthers kind of, I don't want to say branded it, because they did not intend to brand it, but because they were a national organization and they, did ask their members, who are often, pretty visible members of the community, to, be doing this work. And of course, they use this as a talking point to further their political agenda. And I mean that in a positive way, that they're saying, look at, we all, this is possible to feed people. If only we didn't limit food access to people. But of course, you could look at the history of, often the, Black community was often, not, did not have a lot of money, often had to rely on community to help each other, mutual aid. And I talk a little bit about this in the book too, just a brief history of mutual aid. Of course, you can't really give a history of it, but it's something that was always very prevalent in the Black community, just saying we are going to, feed each other, and, and not be thinking about how to withhold food, but how to share what we have. And so, it's been great to see more recently that people are coming back to this concept of mutual aid, and also, I think, increasingly giving credit to these communities that really did have to rely on it because they were left out of the, power structures, but, also did this out of kindness and goodness and community mindedness. And it was a positive thing because they felt not just, insular and within their smaller family, but part of something bigger. And, I think that's so valuable, and I'm glad we're getting back to that.
You write about Cleo Silvers in the book, who was instrumental in running the Black Panther Party's free breakfast program in New York City. Can you talk about how she got involved in starting the breakfast program in New York?
Oh, Cleo tells the story so great, and so I'm not going to be able to do it justice. But she actually was working in New York. She's from Philadelphia, and she was working in kind of the precursor to AmeriCorps. And so they sent her and someone else and other people too, but everyone had a partner to work in different places, often in cities, but not always. And places where they needed young people to help work in the community. And so she really got to know her community well, was doing things with kids in like after school. And because she was working with kids, she often got to, she would have to go to their apartments to see, like, can I get permission to take this, to have this kid in after school? And so she saw how people were living. She saw that there were these, horrific, decrepit apartments that the landlords would not take care of. This is, the Bronx in the 1970s. And she saw the Panthers working there as well. So she got to know the Panthers. The Panthers were active in the community, even did like karate at their dojo. And so she knew them, but she wasn't really thinking, oh, I'm going to join them, because she was doing her own thing. And it wasn't until she got a job at Lincoln Hospital, where they were working to organizing to take over the hospital to protest the horrific state of healthcare, that she began working with some Black Panthers there. And there's this great documentary that came out just a year or so ago called Takeover. Cleo's in it. It's on the New York Times site at one point, so folks should check it out. It was nominated for awards. And the Panthers invited her to join. They're like, sister, we love the work you're doing. You want to join us? And so they sent her down, and she tells this great story where she ran down to the Panther office, and she met Afeni Shakur, mother of Tupac, and although he wasn't born yet,
Wow.
and she became very good friends with Afeni. And she welcomed her into the fold, and she became a Panther that day. And she just continued doing the work she was doing, and then joined them. And everyone was expected to work in the breakfast programs, and so she certainly did her time in the breakfast programs, and helped organize those, and helped do so many other things. Afeni was, among other things, including breakfast program work, she was helping tenants, and Cleo helped with this too, where Cleo, because she was doing this AmeriCorps stuff, it wasn't called AmeriCorps, but she befriended or came into contact with local code enforcement guys who would come see these horrific apartments, and kind of were telling her, and Afeni learned in similar ways, like, this is how you can help these people who are living in these horrible conditions fight back. And so, they could document all of these code violations, put their money in escrow. And so the Panthers helped. There are still multiple buildings today that are co-op, that are owned by people, and descendants of families that the Black Panthers helped to take these buildings back from these delinquent landlords, and then use their rent money to fix it up and own and actually have some equity. So it's really amazing, not just what they did with food, but also with housing and many other issues too.
Can we talk a little bit about Eileen Quinn as well? And can you tell any stories about her that you found out about doing research about the book?
Eileen was, everyone who knew her, who talked to me, was just like, she was a force. I listened to oral histories as well. She was a big woman. She was tall, imposing, always dressed, to the nines. And she was one of the only female business owners in Macomb, which is a small city in about 100 miles north of New Orleans. And she owned a tavern, a restaurant. She was also a bootlegger, and her daughter told me, said, she was proud of it, because this is what she had to do to help support her family. But being one of the only women, and also, in a patriarchal world where there's only so many options for women, she kind of had and she was a single mom as well, with she had 4 kids. And she could talk with the other moms and help, kind of convince them to perhaps, try to register to vote, help with the cause of voter registration and other civil rights efforts in Macomb. But she also was well respected among the men. She was a successful business owner. She really, had the ear of a lot of people, was seen as a community leader, and one of the few women who had that role. But there's some great stories, because there was a lot of horrific arrests, beatings of student activists, of local activists, and they would be perhaps jailed for for a peaceful protest. And she would help. She and some of the women that worked with her would help bring food into the jail. You could bring in food and feed these activists. Yeah. And in doing so, she also was the link between the activists and the outside world, and she would continue their work. These other women would continue their work. And this is what I think is the paradox, perhaps, right? Is that she was so underestimated by the power structure that they really did allow her to go in and, these elaborate, delicious meals. Muhammad Hayes, who was one of the people who had these meals and knew her and was jailed for a time, said, oh yeah, people were like gaining weight in prison because the food was so rich. And of course, this is them, the Black community, saying, we are taking care of our own, and we are feeding them, and they're going to eat better than the jailers, because this is what we do for our people. But they so underestimated her that they allowed her to do this, and not thinking that she was using this as a planning session and doing all the work that she was doing. And so, on one hand, these feminized roles are underestimated, but on the other hand, it could help some of these women have more leadership, have more opportunities, if they know how to work it within this outdated system. And so she really knew how to use these roles to her advantage. But of course, she was not immune from retribution. She was beaten, arrested, fined unfairly, of course, and her house was bombed with 2 of her young children inside. Luckily, everyone was okay, but that was really the moment that this Freedom Summer, which was this main, this is the kind of the moment what the couple months period that I was mostly talking about in the book, where you had a lot of activists working to educate people so that they could pass these onerous poll tests to be able to vote, while doing, freedom schools, teaching people our history, really encouraging people to be active and engaged. And then the bombing of her house was really kind of the moment when people were like, this is enough. There was so much intimidation. There was murder. There were, beatings. There were arrests. And the FBI was really turning the other way and refusing to get involved. I mean, it was a very, very, very dangerous time. And anyone who was doing this work was truly had every right to fear for their lives, not to mention their livelihoods, their homes. And so it was when Aline, a mom, a woman, it shouldn't matter, but it did, saying you're targeting a woman now, when her house was bombed, that was really the moment where people are like, enough, we are not, this cannot continue. And she actually met the president soon thereafter. All these calls for federal government to get involved. She finally was flown to DC with a few other women from her town who had also suffered violence. And how much that did change things. The president really didn't help individually. I listened to recordings of them talking and him later, being mad that their conversation was misconstrued, but she got to say her piece. And after that, there were some allies in the FBI that were able to, move the needle and give them some protections there. But of course, we all know that things did not change overnight and still have not changed to the point that they should have.
I know that when I was in college, I would read a textbook and it would have maybe, if we were lucky, a picture showing the breakfast program, and there'd be like a blurb, but nothing really more. When I read Power Hungry, I really get a sense of the time period, and I think it's the personal stories like the ones you just told that really kind of outline it, because I think otherwise the narrative is that, oh, look, there was this cute little breakfast program and it happened in a vacuum, etc. But I think anything nice that was happening came at great struggle. Do you think we lack this kind of narrative in our education system, both in the up to high school and college?
Oh, there's so much to be said around that. And it's interesting, and my kids are in Brooklyn, and I definitely live in a liberal bubble. My children have had more teachers of color than white teachers, and people are very sensitive to where my kids go, both to daycare and now my kids are 4 and 10 now. And so I don't think that they are lacking that education. Plus, I'm their mom and I tell them stories. But, I had my cousin come, and she lives in Nashville, and she said, her kid is probably in one of the most liberal places that she could possibly be in Nashville. And what her kid is not learning in school is astounding. They cannot mention the existence of LGBTQ people. I think about then even the narratives around Thanksgiving, that my kids are not taught what I was taught. And, and there's so much around civil rights and indigenous rights and indigenous experience that is just not taught to her kid. And so I think more broadly, yes, we're going backwards in what the curriculum is for so many kids around the country. And it's really, it's shameful, because I'm doing research now in Italy, which we could talk about at the end of our chat. But to think about how, let's just say, how Germany has reckoned with their difficult past, and they've done it through education, and how Italy, to different degrees, has grappled with their fascist past, and they did it through education, not as much as Italy. But we in the United States have not grappled with this. And I certainly am not the only person talking about this. We have Clint Smith, who's written a lot about that, both in his books and articles. And, this is something that, to think that this does not have a political agenda would be foolish. It absolutely does. And it's absolutely to keep people under oppressed people more oppressed, and to keep people from thinking critically. Absolutely.
What kind of lessons does Power Hungry have for us today?
Oh, I hope that people are inspired, and after that uninspiring, or maybe it's inspiring to create change, but depressing note, I think there's so many people who we could look to these women and men and just be like, what will it take for us to work beyond, to work for a cause beyond our own individual interests? And that's a question I'm very much interested in. I'm developing, thinking about a class that I might be able to teach at NYU around this. And I keep coming back to this question in the different things that I've been researching, is like, these are people who really truly were willing to die for a cause. And I don't know if I could say the same thing. I don't know, and can we inspire people to the point now in the United States around these issues of what would you dedicate your life to? What kind of change do you want? How could we work to make that change? And also the power of people coming together, doing this together. We really can create change. When you think about what the Panthers did, for instance, but also what they did during Freedom Summer, to have accomplished so much despite having the US government, having the FBI undermining you. That to me is so hopeful of what we can accomplish. So I hope people are inspired.
I'd like to talk about your next book, The Women of War, the Italian assassins, spies, and couriers who fought the Nazis. Can you talk a little bit about this next book coming up?
Oh, certainly. I just got back from it. If I'm a little jet lagged today, it's because I only got back from Italy about 48 hours ago. But I was there for 5 weeks on this great research trip, and I was there the previous summer too, last summer. This story was born kind of at the same time. The seeds of it were planted when I was first discovering Ellen Quinn's story a couple years ago now. And then after I finished that last book, Power Hungry, I was like, what do I want to work on next? And I really wanted to go back to this story. And it actually, the woman that I was profiling in that old version, I'm not even focusing on her anymore. I'm focusing on these 4 other women who are just they're 4 anti-fascist women during the Nazi occupation of of Italy during World War II. And the things that they did to fight the Nazis, to fight fascism, were just, astounding. They definitely risked their lives, and the women were so long, underappreciated, unsung during this time. Women were keeping the resistance alive. Because the men had to be in hiding, or they would be deported or jailed if they weren't working, with and for the fascists and Nazis. And so, women were the ones who transported arms and information. They were the ones who could plant the bombs. They were the ones who could spy and get information. So these stories are really dramatic and really fascinating. And again, I'm doing this deep dive into history. I kind of had the bare bones of what I thought I knew, was taught, understood about World War II and about, particularly in Italy. And now I'm learning so much more about this time. And, also the term fascism has been brought up over the last, 6-8 years or so. And, I think those who are experts on the topic would not say that, we are that, the United States is delving into fascism, or was, but, to truly understand how these strong arm leaders took power and held power, and how some are doing so today. That is, again, another really important history that we, as Americans, as citizens, should understand, so that we can, not just let power structures do whatever they want, but we should be aware and say, okay, how can we make sure that our voices are heard, and that, people are not doing things in their self-interest as opposed to the self-interest of the people.
I wanted to ask you one last question. You must have had letters since Power Hungry came out from people who, were part of the program or benefited from the program. What is some of the letters or feedback or emails you've gotten that have kind of moved you the most?
Oh, I did hear from, some folks who I had some people who emailed and said, "Oh, here are more women. I want you to tell the stories of other women who were doing these amazing things." And I wrote back, I was like, "I wish I could." And then I met this other woman who is, oh my gosh, she's just amazing. She is running, I guess you could say running. She created this uh mural of Black Panther women
Oh,
in Oakland, California, and she kind of has an informal Black Panther museum on the first floor of her house, and she just has such amazing energy. And yeah, I should send it to you so you could a link so you could link it.
okay. I'll
And
do that. Yeah.
yeah, it would be so great. And she's just a wonderful person. So she's probably inspired me the most because and she, I'm forgetting her exact story, but was maybe she went to the breakfast programs, or she had, she had some connection to it as a youth, and then to come back and really see that this is what she sees as her quest in life, is to make sure that these women are getting the due that they deserve, and that the Panthers in general are being honored as they deserve. Yeah, that's just been really wonderful. And then other folks too, just hearing the stories from other Panthers of saying they've come into contact with people who maybe, like in one case, a woman I interviewed for the book in New York, and she said that her kid's teacher was like, I was a kid who the Panthers fed, and I, I went to college, I'm a teacher now, and was just so thankful. So just to see those stories of how people's individual lives were changed was really powerful.
Suzanne, I want to thank you for being on the podcast. We'll have links to Power Hungry in the bio, as well as to some of your other books and websites. Suzanne, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks so much, Dean. Thanks for having me.
That was my conversation with Suzanne Cope. Her new book, Power Hungry, is available through all major distributors and at all better bookstores. It is also available at your local library. Next week, I'll be talking with Allison Walsh about her new book, A Literary Picnic, as well as author Linda Skeens about her book, Blue Ribbon Kitchen. I hope you enjoyed this talk. Until next week, I'll be seeing you at the library.